thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's panel. I was extremely interested in some of the links that I hear from the previous presentations and mine, but I'm going to begin in a few minutes, from links to women in film and news, as well as links to marginalized identities and news, and maybe we can hopefully discuss some of these later after my talk. So, newsrooms, I'm going to take a bit of a turn here and talk a bit about newsrooms, because I think they're a really important site to explore gender relations, given the power of media to set the news agenda. Studies such as the Global Media Monitoring Project that was mentioned earlier, that show that misrepresentation and underrepresentation of women in media continue to remain a problem globally, are extremely important. But why is this the case when we know that women are closing in on numbers in mainstream media, despite there still being a glass ceiling? 60 to 70% of journalism schools globally now women are 60 to 70% of journalism schools now globally. So why are these so persistent? And obviously, it's much more complicated than just numbers. But I'm going to actually try and talk about newsroom culture and newsroom sociology a bit to try and explain some of these issues. And I also want to give a bit of a plug to a study that I just completed with Alison Beale from SFU. We just did the most recent study of women in media in Canada and how far they've gotten in terms of the field and their salaries, and it'll be out in March. So it's the first in the last 10 years, so it should actually got some very good results. So I'm going to make the claim that some answers can be found in the distinct yet lesser roles for women in news historically, and the continued invisibility of their contributions and accomplishments to journalists and the public. It's about the taken for granted understandings of lesser gender roles and that continue to be part of a professional knowledge system and news culture in Canada. You know, I rethought my remarks today and chose to focus on taking a bit of a historical approach to this issue and the relative invisibility of women's contributions to journalism in light of an event on Monday of this week. The Webster Awards were held. It's BC's biggest journalism awards, and they're meant to honor a prominent BC journalist, Jack Webster. And each year, the Websters present what's called the Bruce Hutchinson Lifetime Achievement Award to an outstanding BC journalist. And each year I sit there waiting to see who's going to come up on stage and be given this award, and have, you know, the entire media elite in the province there to listen to them. Did anyone here attend? Anyone? One? Yeah, Lena. This year's winner was Jim Taylor, a well-known BC sports journalist. Last year's winner was Bill Good. The year before was Steve Wyatt, formerly of BCTV. The year before that, Jim Harrison. The year before that, Vaughn Palmer. I think you can see where I'm going with this, unfortunately. The award has been presented for 21 years. Maura Farrow in 1995, a Vancouver Sun journalist I worked with during my time there in the early 90s. The second was Vicki Gabbro. And it's not for a lack of accomplished women journalists that this award is not given to more women. So in the spirit of not just criticizing, but in trying to make sense and trying to understand, you know, the impediments to recognizing women journalists and the challenges that they face, I'm going to focus the rest of my talk today on the historical role of a certain kind of woman journalist. I don't know if anyone's heard of the Sob sister here. It's sort of iconic in popular culture. And the lack of collective memory that journalists and women journalists have about her role and her continued role. So the Sob sister first emerged as a distinct role for women journalists in Canada in the early newspaper wars of the 20th century. And there's a significant amount of literature on these women in both film in the US as well as media history. These women were seen as helping to access difficult interviews and providing a sentimental and emotional account of the news, often related to crime in courts. They were hired to cover the human angle because they were not permitted to write on the important topics. And they entered newsrooms at a time when there were few women there. In 1941, there were women made up 17% of the journalism workforce. By 1957, there were still only 2 women news journalists at the Toronto Star newsroom, and women got a position after one other one left. And one of their main roles at the time in the news area was Sob sisters. They were important, but as I said initially, secondary to the hard news role of their male counterparts. And they had an economic value in that they helped these male colleagues provide scoops for the front page, which had to be constantly remade given the competitive landscape and the fact that Most newspapers at the time were actually sold on the street, not through subscription. Unfortunately, we know very little about their lived experience in Canada because few women journalists wrote biographies. And when they did write, they often consciously shielded their real challenges, their pain, humiliation, frustration, lack of pay, behind sort of, more happy kinds of stories about, how much fun it was to be a journalist at that time. So whatever happened to the Sob sisters? They didn't just disappear. And I find this a really interesting story because the Sob sister reappears in an sort of usual way with the launch of the National Post. And this is some of my research. I was a working journalist. I think this is relevant to this talk. And similar to the first person's comment, I experienced the sort of gender impact of being in a newsroom. I've worked as a crime reporter in major daily newspapers in Canada and the United States before I went back for a PhD in criminology. So I'm happy to address that later as well. So whatever happened to the Sob sister? Well, the launch of the National Post sees the reemergence of this role and the creation of a new columnist. I'm going to ask you to guess who this is in a second, as the, quote, journalistic personification of the National Post. Anyone? Anyone guess who the new latest Sob sister? Christy Blatchford. Mix of hard-boiled crime fiction court coverage and a morality play in her context. And we can definitely see her as part of the history of this role for women. Yet at the time that her column launched, to big fanfare, big news release, she was constructed as groundbreaking, novel, out of the tradition of news. Even Christy herself talked about how new and innovative her approach to news was in court coverage. And I quote, "After we had been there for a while, even others started showing up at trials writing this kind of thing I do, sort of, but with a more traditional format." So even she saw her contribution as novel. And I mean, this obviously has to be seen in the context of the Post sort of ideological position as a neoconservative newspaper and a new national entrant into the media market. But what I want to leave you with today is the collective amnesia that greeted the launch of her column and the reemergence of the Sob sister, and talk a bit about it as both surprising and problematic. I think we need to constantly monitor the ways that women do and do not get written into the national journalism narrative. And nowhere was she presented as following in the footsteps of early women journalists. In Christie's case, the fact that her contribution to women in news is complicated, given her anti-feminist ideology and the real gains that her high visibility and significant salary, actually there's a whole part of a book chapter written about how much money she was able to kind of pull from the National Post to get over there. It's worth a read. Should not erase the discussion of her role in the history of the ongoing identity struggle of women journalists. And she's still one of the few women columnists in the news section in Canadian media. So my intent during this brief time today was to raise this example and the limited collective memory of women in media in this instance, to challenge us to remember the past and all of its complications in order to understand and intervene in the present. Silences around Lifetime Achievement Awards like the Jack Webster Awards, the Jack Webster Awards, and women in media and their relation to power are still contested and not well enough understood. So, thank you.
So we're going to open it up to questions. Before we do, I just want to make a couple observations about the fantastic comments from everyone. When Marcia talks about women's representation in cultural products, and in particular in family films, and the link between representation and the employment of women in the film industry and in positions of power, certainly links to some quite a lot of research that's been done in my area around news as well. And Jen's talk about women and sexuality, especially marginalized identities, and then Mary Lynn talking about the sociology of journalism, the sort of culture of the newsroom. It's all representing, or at least indicating, as a panel theme that and almost what's implied and not spoken directly yet is that the media, both the cultural media and the news media, implies certain facts about women. It's a discourse that affects while it both reflects the dominant social values of what is considered ideal, but it also takes part, as Gay Tuckman said 30 years ago, in what's called the symbolic annihilation of alternatives. And it's that kind of research, the kind of research and work that people on this panel have been doing, that demonstrates how the media not only reflects, but importantly reinforces and constructs gender disparity in Canada and globally. So these representations in the media have to be seen as fundamentally ideological struggles between what is legitimate and what is marginal, between what is dominant and what is invisible, and between what is natural and what is deviant. And that these studies such as these can uncover these hegemonic and methods of containment about what is and what should be a woman. So this work that people are doing on this panel, I think, reflects that in a fantastic way. We're really pleased everyone's here. I'd like to open it up to questions, and please use the microphone because we are recording this to put up on our website, as well as videoing it so that we can make this available for people who weren't able to come. So please line up at the mic if you have questions for any of the panels.